An Iroquois widow found him shaking by the old well at dawn, clutching a bloodied knife and whispering about the men who'd come in the night. She thought saving one terrified child would be simple, but some rescues uncover secrets that entire territories have killed to keep buried. The morning mist clung to the valley like smoke from a dying fire when Tala night wind found him. She'd risen before sunrise to draw water from the old stone well that marked the boundary between her late husband's land and what the white settlers called civilization. The well had been built by Spanish missionaries decades before either culture claimed this corner of Arizona territory, and it served both communities with the kind of neutral practicality that kept fragile peace intact.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but he crouched beside the well's rim like an old man bearing the weight of unspeakable memories. His clothes were torn and stained with something darker than dirt, his bare feet cut and bleeding from running across rocky ground. In his small hands, he clutched a hunting knife with a blade that gleamed red in the early light. Tala approached slowly, the way she might approach a wounded wolf that could either flee or attack depending on how cornered it felt. She'd seen enough trauma in her 32 years to recognize the signs, from her own people's forced relocations to the raids and counter-raids that had defined frontier life for longer than anyone wanted to remember. This child had witnessed something that would live behind his eyes forever. "Come here, child," she said softly in English, her accent carrying the musical cadence of her native Oneida tongue. The boy's head snapped up, revealing blue eyes, wide with terror and something else, something that made Tala's breath catch in her throat. Those weren't just the eyes of someone who'd seen violence. They were the eyes of someone who'd been forced to participate in it. The knife in his hands wasn't just bloody, it was held with the familiarity of recent use. This child hadn't just witnessed horror, he'd been part of it, willing or not. Tala felt the morning air grow colder as she realized she might be looking at either a victim or something far more complicated. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Or crying, or both. They said they'd come back if I told anyone. They said they'd know." His grip on the knife tightened, knuckles white against the wooden handle. "But I had to do what they said, or they would have hurt her worse." Tala's maternal instincts warred with the survival skills that had kept her alive through 2 decades of frontier warfare. Every rational part of her mind said to back away, to ride to the nearest settlement and let the territorial marshal handle whatever this child represented. But looking at his small frame shaking with exhaustion and terror, she saw her own son who died of fever 3 winters ago, and her decision was made before her mind could override her heart. She knelt beside the well, bringing herself to the boy's eye level, her voice gentle despite the warning bells clanging in her head. "What's your name, little one?" The endearment came naturally in her native language before she translated it to English. "I won't let anyone hurt you. You have my word, Mickey," he whispered, "Mickey Carson." "But that's not what they called me." His voice dropped even lower. "They called me their little soldier. Said I was small enough to go places grown-ups couldn't. Said I was quiet enough to do things without being noticed." The implications hit Tala like a physical blow. This child had been used, trained, turned into a weapon by people who understood that innocence could be the perfect disguise for violence. She'd heard whispers of such things, stories that drifted through trading posts and tribal gatherings, about children being taken and transformed into tools for purposes too dark to speak aloud. "Mickey Carson," she repeated, letting the name settle between them like a bridge. "That's a good name. Strong name. Whatever they called you, whatever they made you do, that's not who you are." She gestured to the knife in his hands. "Can you tell me about this? About what happened?" Mickey's eyes darted to the horizon, scanning for threats that might be real or might be the phantoms of trauma. "There was a family," he said, words tumbling out like water from a broken dam. "The Hendersons. They had a homestead about 10 miles east, near Copper Creek. Nice people. They gave me food once when I was hungry. Tala knew the family, had traded with them for supplies during particularly harsh winters. Good people, hard-working, the kind of settlers who tried to coexist with the native tribes rather than drive them out. The fact that Mickey spoke of them in past tense made her stomach clench with dread. The men came 3 nights ago, Mickey continued, his voice taking on the flat, mechanical tone of someone recounting events too terrible to process emotionally. 5 of them, maybe 6. Professional killers, not random raiders. They knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it. Tala settled herself more comfortably on the ground, recognizing that this story would take time and that interrupting might cause the boy to retreat back into silence. Whatever had happened to the Henderson family, Mickey had been both witness and unwilling participant, and getting the full truth would require patience she wasn't sure she possessed. They didn't just kill them, Mickey said, staring at the knife as if it belonged to someone else. They made it look like an Indian raid. Took scalps, left arrows, burned the buildings in a specific way. But before they did any of that, they made me go inside. The boy's voice broke, and Tala saw tears finally beginning to form in those haunted blue eyes. Mrs. Henderson was still alive when I found her. Hurt bad, but alive. She recognized me, smiled even though she was dying. Asked me to help her. Tala felt ice forming in her veins as she began to understand the full scope of what had been done to this child. What did they make you do, Mickey? They said if I didn't finish her quick and clean, they'd make it. Last hours. Said they'd do the same to her daughter if I didn't prove I could follow orders. Mickey's hands shook so violently that the knife blade caught the morning light like a signal mirror. So I did it. I looked her in the eyes, and I did it because I thought I was saving her from something worse. The confession hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Tila had seen men broken by war, had watched warriors return from battles with parts of their souls left on distant battlefields, but she'd never seen someone so young carrying such a weight. This child had been forced to choose between different kinds of evil, and the fact that he'd chosen mercy over cruelty didn't lessen the burden he now carried. They laughed afterward, Mickey continued, his voice barely audible. Sad I was. Finally ready for the real work. Said the Henderson job was just practice for something bigger they had planned. Something about a treaty meeting, important people coming together, and how one small boy could change the course of history if he was in the right place at the right time. Tala's blood turned to ice water. A treaty meeting, tribal leaders, and territorial officials in the same location. The kind of gathering where a single act of violence could ignite a war that would consume the entire region. If these men were planning to use Mickey as an assassin at such an event, the consequences would be measured in thousands of lives. Where is this meeting supposed to happen? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the urgency clawing at her chest. When? Fort Bridger, 4 days from now. Chiefs from 6 tribes, the territorial governor, military commanders. They're calling it the Final Peace Summit. Mickey's eyes met hers with devastating clarity. The men said all it would take was one dead chief with a white boy's knife in his back, and every tribe within 500 miles would go to war. The scope of the conspiracy began to crystallize in Tala's mind like frost forming on winter glass. Someone wanted to prevent peace, wanted to ensure that the cycle of violence between settlers and tribes continued. But why would anyone benefit from endless warfare unless they were profiting from the conflict itself? Did you hear any names? She asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. Anything that might tell us who these men work for? Mickey nodded slowly. The leader, the one who gave all the orders, they called him Colonel. But not like he was still in the army, more like it was just what people called him. He had gray hair and a scar across his throat, talked real quiet, but everyone jumped when he spoke. The others were afraid of him, I could tell. Tala filed away every detail. knowing that identification would be crucial if they survived long enough to expose this conspiracy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
What else did you hear? Any mention of who they work for? Why? They want war instead of peace. Money. Mickey said with the bitter wisdom of someone who'd learned too young that most evil came down to profit. They talked about contracts, about how much certain people were paying to make sure the treaties failed. Something about railroads and mining rights. Land that's worth nothing during wartime, but millions once it's pacified and developed. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Tyla had heard whispers of Eastern businessmen who saw the ongoing conflicts as opportunities. Men who profited from selling weapons to both sides while buying up devastated land for pennies on the dollar. If peace broke out, their profits would disappear along with their opportunity to acquire vast territories at bargain prices. There's something else, Mickey said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something they said about you. About your people. They know about the well, about how it's neutral ground. They said if their plan worked, places like this would be the first to burn because mixed communities prove that peace is possible. Tala felt the world shift beneath her like quicksand. These men didn't just want to prevent the treaty. They wanted to eliminate any evidence that coexistence was possible. Her small homestead, built with her late husband on land that technically belonged to neither culture, represented everything they sought to destroy. How did you get away from them? She asked. Though part of her dreaded the answer, no one. Escape from professional killers unless they were allowed to escape, which meant, I didn't, Mickey said, confirming her worst fears. They let me go. Told me to run, to find somewhere safe, to think about what I'd seen and what would happen. If I talked, they said they'd be watching, and when the time came for the real job, they'd find me. The morning sun had risen high enough to burn away the mist, leaving the valley exposed and vulnerable. Tala realized that their conversation at the well might already have been observed, that even now eyes might be watching from the surrounding hills. Every instinct screamed at her to take Mickey and run, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was coming. But running would only delay the inevitable. If these men were planning to assassinate tribal leaders at Fort Bridger, thousands of innocent people would die in the resulting war. Her own people, Mickey's people, families who had nothing to do with Eastern business interests or railroad fortunes, would pay the price in blood. Listen to me carefully. Mickey Carson, she said, gripping his shoulders gently but firmly. What happened to you, what they made you do, that's not who you are. You're just a child who got caught up in something evil, and none of it is your fault. But now we have a choice. Mickey's eyes searched her face with desperate hope. What kind of choice? We can run and hide and hope they forget about us. Or we can fight back. We can try to stop them from hurting anyone else. Tala paused, knowing that what she said next would change both their lives forever. But if we fight, it's going to be dangerous. They'll come for us with everything they have. Good, Mickey said with startling fierceness. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting them win. He looked down at the bloody knife still clenched in his hands. Mrs. Henderson died believing I was trying to help her. Maybe I can make that true. Tala saw something she hadn't expected in the boy's face, a spark of defiance that reminded her of young warriors preparing for their first battle. This child had been broken and remade as a weapon, but perhaps he could be remade again as something stronger. Something those who'd used him would never anticipate. Then we need to get moving, she said, standing and extending her hand to help them up. 4 days to Fort Bridger means we need to leave within the hour if we're going to beat them there. And first, we need to get you cleaned up and fed and armed with something better than a knife meant for butchering. Mickey took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, the symbolic gesture marking the moment when he chose to trust someone again after everything that had been done to him. You really think we can stop them? Just the two of us against trained killers. Not just the two of us, Tala said, her mind already working through possibilities. I know people warriors. From different tribes who understand what war really costs. White soldiers who've seen enough death to value peace. If we can get word to the right people, if we can prove what's really happening. She looked toward the horizon where Fort Bridger lay 4 days distant, where the fate of the entire territory would be decided by men who thought they could control history through violence and manipulation. Besides, they're not expecting resistance from a native woman and the child they thought they'd broken. Sometimes the best weapon is being underestimated. Mickey wiped the blood from the knife blade with his torn shirt, his young face set with determination that belonged on someone much older. What do you need me to do? For now? Stay close and stay ready. But Mickey, Tala's voice carried the weight of a promise that went deeper than words. Whatever happens next, you're not alone anymore. Whatever they made you do, whoever they tried to turn you into, that's over now. From this moment forward, you choose who you want to be, the boy nodded once. And Tala saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of hope struggling to life in the darkness that had consumed him. It would take time to heal what had been done to his spirit, but healing could begin with purpose, with the knowledge that his suffering might serve to prevent others from experiencing the same. As they walked toward her cabin to gather supplies and weapons, Tala found herself thinking about her late husband, about the dreams they'd shared of a territory where different peoples could live side by side without fear. Those dreams had seemed to die with him, but perhaps they were about to be reborn in the most unlikely form possible. A traumatized child and a widowed woman who refused to let evil triumph without a fight. The war for the soul of the Arizona territory was about to begin, and its outcome would be decided not by armies or politicians, but by whether two people who had lost everything could find the strength to save everyone else. Tala's cabin sat nestled against a red rock formation that provided natural protection on 3 sides, positioned where her late husband's tactical mind had placed it for maximum defensive advantage. The structure itself told the story of 2 cultures learning to blend. Adobe walls in the Spanish style supported by log construction techniques her husband had learned from mountain men, with defensive features that reflected his experience, fighting both with and against various armies across the frontier. Inside, Mickey sat at her wooden table while she tended to his wounded feet with supplies that represented the convergence of 3 healing traditions. Native herbs her grandmother had taught her to use, army medical supplies her husband had left behind, and techniques learned from the Mexican curandera who served the mixed community that had grown around the neutral well. This is going to hurt, she warned, applying a poultice that would draw infection from the deepest cuts. Mickey gritted his teeth but didn't make a sound, his young face displaying the stoic endurance that had helped him survive his ordeal. You've been walking on these wounds for days. How did you keep going? They taught me, he said quietly, watching her work with the fascination of someone learning to trust gentle hands after experiencing only violence. Pain management, they called it. How to keep moving when your body wants to quit. How to ignore everything except the mission. The clinical way he spoke about his conditioning made Tala's blood boil with protective fury. These men had taken a child and systematically destroyed his ability to recognize his own humanity, turning basic survival instincts into tools for their use. But she kept her voice calm, understanding that anger now would only reinforce his learned responses. Well, the mission now is healing, she said, wrapping his feet in clean cloth strips. And survival, and stopping the people who did this. To you, but first we need help. The kind of help that requires trust, and trust requires honesty. I need to know everything, Mickey. Every detail you can remember about their operation. As she worked, Mickey began to share information with the precision of someone trained to observe and report. The men had operated from a camp in the Badlands, rotating between 3 different locations to avoid detection. They'd been gathering intelligence on tribal movements, military patrols, and civilian populations for months, building detailed maps of who went where and when. They had files, he said, his voice taking on the mechanical tone he used when recounting traumatic memories. Thick folders on important people, tribal leaders, army officers, territorial officials. They knew where everyone would be, what routes they'd take, even what they'd be wearing. Like they had someone on the inside feeding them information. Tala's hands stilled on the bandages. A conspiracy this detailed required resources and connections that went far beyond hired killers and Eastern businessmen. Someone with access to military communications, tribal council meetings, and territorial government planning was providing intelligence to enemies of peace. Did you see any of these files? Any names or details that might help us identify their source? Mickey closed his eyes, accessing memories he'd been trained to retain with perfect clarity. There was one file they kept separate from the others, marked with red ink. Inside were copies of official documents, orders, meeting schedules, things that should have been secret. The colonel treated it like it was more valuable than gold. Do you remember any specific documents? Anything that might tell us who has that level of access? Fort Bridger duty rosters, showing which units would be guarding the Peace Summit. Tribal delegation travel plans that hadn't been announced publicly yet. And correspondence between the territorial governor and someone in Washington about changing military command structure after the treaties were signed. The implications hit Tala like a physical blow. Someone in a position of ultimate trust was betraying both sides, feeding information to people who wanted to prevent peace at any cost. The scale of the conspiracy was larger than she'd imagined, reaching into the highest levels of both military and civilian authority. We need to get word to people who can act on this information, she said, finishing the bandages and moving to a wooden chest that held her husband's military equipment. But we can't use normal channels if there's a traitor in the command structure. We need to find someone we can trust absolutely. She opened the chest and began removing items that told the story of a soldier's career, weapons cleaned and maintained despite their owner's death, maps marked with the locations of battles fought for causes that seemed increasingly distant with time. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay something that might change everything. What's that? Mickey asked, watching her unwrap a wooden box carved with symbols he didn't recognize, but somehow found comforting. The craftsmanship spoke of patience and reverence, the kind of work done to honor something sacred. Messages, Tala said, opening the box to reveal dozens of small carved tokens, each one unique and intricate. My people have ways of communicating that don't depend on written words or official channels. These tokens carry specific meanings, and when they're sent to the right people, they can mobilize resources faster than any army telegraph. She selected 3 tokens from the collection, each one representing a different aspect of the crisis they faced. The first bore the image of a broken arrow, the symbol for betrayal from within. The second showed 2 animals sharing water, representing the threat to neutral ground and mixed communities. The third displayed a child's handprint surrounded by thorns, indicating innocence corrupted by violence. Each of these will go to a different person, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of traditions that stretched back generations. Warriors, medicine people, and leaders who understand that some fights transcend tribal boundaries. When they receive these tokens, they'll know that the peace itself is in danger. Mickey watched with fascination as she prepared the tokens for transport, wrapping each one in materials that would protect them during their journey, while marking them with additional symbols that indicated urgency and authenticity. How long will it take for help to reach us? That depends on how far the recipients have to travel, and how quickly they can mobilize others. But Mickey, you need to understand something important. The help that's coming won't be soldiers following orders or officials acting on authority. It'll be people who choose to fight because they believe peace is worth preserving. As if summoned by their conversation about trust and loyalty, The sound of approaching horses reached them through the cabin's thick walls. Tala moved to the window with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to potential threats, positioning herself where she could observe without being seen. 3 riders approached the cabin, their posture and formation indicating they came with serious purpose but not necessarily hostile intent. She recognized the lead rider immediately, a man whose presence changed the entire dynamic of their situation. "Someone's coming," she told Mickey, her voice carrying both relief and apprehension. "Someone who might be able to help us if we can convince him that the threat is real." Captain James Morrison of the 7th Cavalry had served on the frontier long enough to recognize the difference between necessary violence and the kind of brutality that served no purpose except to perpetuate cycles of revenge. His weathered face bore scars from conflicts on both sides of the cultural divide, and his eyes held the tired wisdom of a soldier who'd learned that most wars could be prevented if the right people chose courage over convenience. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle, his uniform showing the practical modifications of an officer who cared more about effectiveness than regulation appearance. Behind him, 2 junior officers remained mounted but alert, their hands resting casually near their weapons in the manner of men trained to expect trouble. "Mrs. Nightwind," he said, touching the brim of his hat with respectful courtesy. "I received your message about urgent matters concerning Fort Bridger. I came as quickly as possible, though I'll admit your method of communication raised more questions than it answered." Tala stepped onto the cabin's wooden porch, keeping Mickey behind her until she could gauge Morrison's reaction to the boys' presence. She'd known the captain for 3 years, trading information and maintaining the fragile peace that kept their respective communities from destroying each other. But this situation would test the limits of their mutual trust. "Captain Morrison, thank you for coming so quickly. The matter I need to discuss concerns a threat to the peace summit that goes beyond anything we've faced before. But before I explain, I need your word that nothing said here will be reported through normal military channels." Morrison's expression grew serious as he absorbed both her words and the tension radiating from her posture. "That's a significant request, Mrs. Nightwind. I can't give my word to conceal information that might affect military operations without understanding what we're discussing." "Then let me show you something that will help you understand," she sighed, stepping aside to reveal Mickey standing in the doorway. The boy's appearance told its own story, the exhaustion and trauma written clearly across his young features, the way he held himself ready to run or fight despite his obvious vulnerability. Morrison's trained eye took in every detail of Mickey's condition, from the carefully bandaged feet to the haunted expression that spoke of experiences no child should survive. "Son," he said gently, "what's your name?" "Michael Carson, sir." Mickey replied with the automatic respect that had been beaten into him through months of brutal conditioning. "But the men who had me called me other things. Things I'd rather not repeat." The captain's jaw tightened as he began to understand the implications of what he was seeing. "Mrs. Nightwind, perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. What I'm seeing here suggests circumstances that require immediate attention." Once inside the cabin, with Morrison's men posted as sentries outside, Tala and Mickey began to tell their story. They shared everything from the Henderson family massacre to the planned assassination at Fort Bridger. Watching Morrison's expression grow darker with each revelation, "You're describing a conspiracy that would require resources and intelligence access far beyond what any criminal organization should possess," Morrison said when they finished. "The level of detailed information you're talking about suggests collaboration from someone within the military or territorial government." "That's exactly what we think," Tala said. "And that's why we can't use normal channels to expose it. If there's a traitor in the command structure, reporting through official channels would only warn them that their operation has been compromised." Morrison stood and began pacing the small cabin, his military mind working through the tactical implications of what he'd heard. If even half of what you're telling me is true, then we're facing a threat that could destabilize the entire territory. But the evidence you have is largely the testimony of a traumatized child against professional killers who've covered their tracks. Then we need to get more evidence, Mickey said with startling determination. I know where their camps are, how they operate, what they're planning. If we can catch them in the act, if we can document their preparations for the assassination. Absolutely not, Morrison said firmly. Son, what you've been through is more than enough. No one expects you to put yourself in danger again. But I'm the only one who can get close enough, Mickey persisted. They think they own me, think I'll do whatever they say when the time comes. If I go back to them, if I pretend to cooperate, that's suicide, Tala interrupted. Mickey, these people have already proven they'll kill anyone who threatens their operation. If they suspect you've talked to anyone, then we make sure they don't suspect, Morrison said quietly, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. Mrs. Nightwind, what if we approach this differently? What if instead of trying to expose the conspiracy, we use their own methods against them? Tala looked at him sharply. What do you mean? They're planning to use a child as an assassin. Because no one would suspect such a thing. But what if that child was working for us instead? What if we turned their own plan into a trap? The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. All three of them understood the implications, the risks, and the terrible irony of using the enemy's own tactics to defeat them. But they also understood that conventional approaches had little chance of success against an enemy this well connected and resourceful. It would mean putting Mickey back in the hands of people who've already traumatized him beyond measure, Tala said slowly. The psychological damage alone, I can handle it, Mickey said with quiet confidence that surprised all of them. Mrs. Nightwind, you told me I get to choose who I want to be now. Well, I choose to be someone who stops them from hurting anyone. Else, I choose to make Mrs. Henderson's death mean something. Morrison studied the boy's face, seeing not just determination, but the kind of inner strength that separated survivors from victims. Son, what you're suggesting would require you to maintain a deception under extreme pressure, while gathering intelligence that could save thousands of lives. Are you certain you understand what that means? It means pretending to be what they made me while actually being what Mrs. Nightwind is helping me become, Mickey replied. It means using their training against them. It means finally fighting back. Tala felt her heart breaking and swelling simultaneously as she watched this remarkable child choose courage over safety, purpose over protection. But she also felt the weight of responsibility for what they were contemplating. The knowledge that their decision could either save the territory or destroy the innocents they were trying to protect. If we do this, she said carefully, it has to be done right. We need backup plans, communication methods, ways to extract Mickey if things go wrong. And we need to move fast, because every hour we delay gives them more time to perfect their own preparations. Morrison nodded grimly. I can provide military support, but it has to be done unofficially. Personnel I trust absolutely, operating outside normal command structure. If there is a traitor in the system, we can't risk any official knowledge of our operations. As they began to plan their desperate gambit, none of them spoke about the obvious truth hanging over their preparations. They were about to pit a traumatized child, a grieving widow, and a handful of soldiers against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial authority. But sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the only ones positioned to prevent the greatest tragedies, and sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change the course of history itself. The abandoned silver mine 20 miles northeast of Tala's cabin had been worked out 5 years earlier, leaving behind a labyrinth of tunnels that provided perfect concealment for Morrison's hand-picked team. In the depths of the earth, lit by carefully shielded oil lamps, 8 men worked with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for a mission that could determine the fate of an entire territory. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos had served with Morrison through 3 Indian campaigns and 2 border conflicts, earning his stripes not through blind obedience, but through the kind of tactical intelligence that kept men alive when superior officers made fatal mistakes. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he modified a small derringer to appear damaged while remaining fully functional. "The weapon has to look like something a child might find and hide," Santos explained to Mickey, who watched. "Every movement with the absorption of someone whose life might depend on understanding these details. But when you need it, it has to fire true on the first shot because you won't get a second chance." Corporal David Ironhorse, a Lakota warrior who joined the army after his own people rejected his belief that cooperation offered better survival odds than endless warfare, worked on communication equipment that would allow the team to maintain contact across impossible distances. His modifications to standard military signal mirrors could transmit coded messages that appeared to be simple reflections of sunlight. "Each flash pattern has a specific meaning," he explained, demonstrating the technique. 3 short, 2 long means you're in immediate danger and need extraction. 5 short flashes means you've identified the target. 1 long flash means abort the mission and run. Private Tommy Chun, whose Chinese heritage had made him unwelcome in most military units until Morrison recognized his genius for disguise. And infiltration, applied theatrical makeup that would make Mickey appear even younger and more vulnerable than his 8 years. The transformation was unsettling, turning a child who'd already suffered too much into the perfect image of helpless innocence. "The key is making them believe you're broken," Chun said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated because of appearance. "They need to see exactly what they expect to see. A traumatized child who'll do anything to avoid more pain." Tala watched these preparations with emotions that warred between admiration for their thoroughness and horror at what they were. Asking of Mickey, the boy himself seemed to have retreated into a state of calm detachment that reminded her uncomfortably of how he'd appeared when she first found him by the well. "Are you certain you can do this?" she asked quietly, drawing him aside while the soldiers continued their work. "Mickey, there's no shame in changing your mind. What we're asking of you is more than most grown men could handle." "I keep thinking about Mrs. Henderson," he replied, his young voice carrying a weight that belonged on someone decades older. "About how she smiled at me even though she was dying, how she trusted me to help her. If I don't do this, if I let them kill more people like her, then her death really was meaningless." Morrison appeared at Tala's shoulder, his expression reflecting the same mixture of pride and anguish that she felt watching Mickey's transformation. "We've received intelligence that confirms your information about the Colonel's operation. 3 separate sources report unusual activity in the Badlands, men moving between concealed camps with military precision." "What kind of sources?" Tala asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison's network extended far beyond official military channels, reaching into the complex web of relationships that define frontier survival. Traders who've noticed changes in normal travel patterns. Hunters who found evidence of large groups camping where no one should be. And a postal worker who's been asked to hold mail for pickup at locations that don't officially exist. Morrison's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "We're dealing with an operation that's been months in planning, with resources that suggest backing from very wealthy interests." The implication sent a chill through Tyla that had nothing to do with the mine's underground coolness. If the conspiracy had been developing for months, it meant the planned assassination was just one part of a larger scheme to destabilize the entire region. The peace summit wasn't just a target. It was a trigger for something much more comprehensive. "There's something else," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "We've identified the probable source of the intelligence leak. Major Harrison Blackwood, territorial liaison to the Peace Commission. He has access to everything: military communications, tribal negotiations, Civilian government planning. Tala felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood. Any relation to the businessman who's been buying up land after Indian raids. His brother. And now we understand why certain attacks have been so precisely targeted. Why they've hit families and communities that pose specific threats to land acquisition schemes. It's not just about preventing peace. It's about ensuring profitable warfare. The scope of the conspiracy expanded in Tala's mind like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The Blackwood brothers had created a system where violence generated profit on multiple levels, from weapons sales to land speculation to government contracts for military operations. Peace would destroy their entire business model. How do we expose something this big? She asked, though she feared the answer. If Major Blackwood has been feeding information to his brother for months, if they have that level of access and resources, we document everything, Morrison said grimly. We gather evidence that's so comprehensive and damning that no amount of political influence can suppress it. And we make sure that evidence reaches people who have the power and courage to act on it. Santos approached them with the modified Derringer, its small size making it perfect for concealment, while its appearance suggested the kind of weapon a desperate child might acquire through luck or theft. It's ready, he said simply. And God help us all for what we're about to ask this boy to do. The Badlands stretched before them like a vision of the world's end. Red rock formations twisted by wind and time into shapes that suggested bones of ancient monsters. In this desolate landscape, the Colonel's operation had established 3 camps positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation while remaining invisible to casual travelers. Mickey rode alone across the broken terrain, his small figure dwarfed by the immensity of the wasteland around him. Behind him, invisible among the rock formations, Morrison's team maintained surveillance through high-powered telescopes while Tala watched with her heart in her throat as the boy she'd come to love disappeared into the domain of his tormentors. The first camp appeared exactly where Mickey had said it would be, concealed in a box canyon that provided natural fortification while offering multiple escape routes. Through her own telescope, Tala could see movement among the rocks as sentries identified the approaching rider and began to signal their recognition. "They're expecting him," Morrison observed, his trained eye noting the lack of alarm or surprise among the guards, which means they've been watching us or they have some other way of knowing he'd return. The thought sent ice through Tala's veins. If the conspirators had been observing their preparations, if they knew about Morrison's involvement or suspected that Mickey had been turned, then they were sending the boy into a trap that would accomplish nothing except his death. But it was too late to abort the mission now. Mickey had already been spotted by the sentries, and any attempt to signal him would only confirm whatever suspicions they might have. All they could do was watch and hope that their preparation had been thorough enough to protect him against whatever waited in the canyon. Through the telescope, Tala watched as Mickey was led into the camp by guards who treated him with the casual brutality of men accustomed to handling human property. She saw him stumble and fall, saw the guards laugh at his apparent weakness, and felt her fingernails dig into her palms as she forced herself to remain motionless. "He's playing his part perfectly," Morrison murmured, his own voice tight with suppressed emotion. "They see exactly what they expect to see, a broken child who's returned because he has nowhere else to go." But Tala could see more than that through her lens. She could see the subtle ways Mickey positioned himself to observe the camp's layout, how he counted weapons and estimated the number of men while appearing to cower in fear. The boy was gathering intelligence with the skill of a trained operative while maintaining a performance that would have impressed professional actors. The colonel himself emerged from the largest tent, and even at a distance, Tala could see why this man inspired fear in hardened killers. He moved with the contained violence of a predator, every gesture calculated to demonstrate his absolute authority over everything and everyone in his domain. "Son of a bitch" looks exactly like his description, Santos whispered through the communication system Iron Horse had established. Scar across the throat, gray hair, the way he carries himself like he owns the world. Through carefully positioned mirrors, they watched as the colonel interrogated Mickey with the methodical thoroughness of a man accustomed to extracting truth through intimidation. But the boy's performance never wavered. His responses consistent with someone who'd fled in terror and returned only because he feared the consequences of staying away. He's convincing them, Morrison observed, with grudging admiration. Whatever else happens, that boy has the nerves of a professional spy. But Tyla noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. The colonel wasn't just interrogating Mickey, he was studying him with the clinical interest of someone evaluating a tool for a specific purpose. Whatever they had planned for the boy at Fort Bridger, it was more complex than simply having him commit murder. Inside the canyon camp, Mickey maintained his facade of traumatized compliance, while his mind cataloged every detail that might prove useful. The operation was larger than he'd initially reported, with at least 30 men divided between the 3 camps and equipped with military-grade weapons that suggested official backing. "You ran away from us, boy," the colonel said, his quiet voice somehow more threatening than shouting would have been. "You disappeared for 3 days without permission, without explanation. That kind of behavior requires correction. The correction came in the form of a beating that was carefully calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage, administered by men who understood exactly how much punishment a child's body could absorb. Mickey endured it without crying out, his training in pain management allowing him to compartmentalize the physical agony while his mind remained focused on gathering information. "Now then," the colonel continued once the beating was finished, "perhaps you'll be more forthcoming about where you've been and who you might have spoken to. We know you didn't simply wander the wilderness for 3 days, boy. Children don't survive that long alone without help." Mickey's response was a masterpiece of misdirection, a story about finding shelter in abandoned buildings and surviving on scraps scavenged from empty homesteads. The details were specific enough to be believable while containing nothing that could lead back to Tala or Morrison. "I was scared," he whispered, allowing real tears to flow as he remembered Mrs. Henderson's face in her final moments. "I kept thinking about what you made me do, about the blood, and I just wanted to hide somewhere nobody could find me." The colonel studied him with predatory intensity, searching for signs of deception while Mickey projected the perfect image of a traumatized child who'd been broken by his experiences. Finally, the man nodded with satisfaction. "Fear is a useful emotion, boy, when properly channeled. And you're about to learn just how useful it can be. Our timeline has been moved up, thanks to certain complications that have arisen. The operation at Fort Bridger now happens tomorrow night instead of 3 days hence." The news hit Mickey like a physical blow, but he forced himself to show only confusion rather than alarm. Tomorrow night meant they had less than 18 hours to prevent a massacre that would ignite territorial warfare. "Tomorrow," the colonel continued, "you'll be taken to Fort Bridger disguised as the orphan survivor of an Indian raid. The garrison commander is expecting you, having been informed that a traumatized child requires his protection during the peace summit. You'll be housed in the officers' quarters, giving you access to the tribal delegates when they arrive." The plan's diabolical brilliance became clear as the colonel explained the details. Mickey wouldn't just kill a tribal leader. He'd do it in a way that made it appear the child had been driven insane by trauma, striking out at any native face that reminded him of his supposed attackers. The assassination would seem like tragic madness rather than calculated murder. "And after I do it," Mickey asked, his voice small and frightened, "what happens to me then?" The colonel's smile was the most terrifying thing Mickey had ever seen. "After you complete your mission, boy, you'll try to escape. Unfortunately, you'll be shot while attempting to flee the scene." Tragic, really, but understandable given the circumstances. The poor child, driven mad by trauma, dies in a final act of violence. Mickey felt his blood turn to ice as he realized they'd never intended for him to survive. He was as disposable to them as every other victim of their conspiracy, useful only as long as he served their purposes. "Don't look so frightened, boy," the colonel said with mock concern. "You'll be serving the higher purpose, helping to ensure that this territory remains profitable for the right people. Your death will have meaning, even if no one remembers your name." As night fell over the Badlands, Mickey lay in the tent they'd assigned him while planning his escape. But escape meant more than just getting away from the camp. It meant getting word to Morrison and Tala about the accelerated timeline while positioning himself to disrupt the assassination plot. The modified Derringer Santos had given him remained, hidden in a specially constructed compartment in his boot, undetected during their searches, but ready for use when the moment came. But one small pistol against 30 armed men would accomplish nothing except ensuring his own death. Through the tent walls, he could hear the conspirators making final preparations for tomorrow's operation. Weapons being cleaned and loaded, explosives being prepared for what sounded like multiple coordinated attacks, and most chilling of all, discussion of other children who'd been trained for similar missions in different locations. The conspiracy was even larger than they'd suspected, with assassination teams being deployed to prevent peace negotiations across the entire frontier. Mickey's mission at Fort Bridger was just one piece of a coordinated campaign to ensure that warfare continued indefinitely. As he lay in darkness listening to the sounds of evil making ready, Mickey thought about Mrs. Henderson's final smile, and Tala's promise that he could choose who he wanted to be. Tomorrow he would have the chance to make that choice in the most definitive way possible. But first, he had to survive the night and find a way to warn the people he'd come to love about the true scope of the horror that was about to unfold. The camp had settled into the uneasy quiet that comes before dawn, with only 2 sentries maintaining watch over the sleeping conspirators. Mickey had spent hours memorizing their patrol patterns, timing their movements with the precision of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail of his captor's routines. At precisely 2:17 a.m., when both guards were at the farthest points of their circuits, Mickey slipped from his tent with the fluid silence of someone who'd been trained in stealth by experts, who viewed detection as failure punishable by death. The skills they'd beaten into him for their own purposes now served to undermine everything they'd worked to achieve. He moved between the sleeping forms of killers and conspirators like a ghost, pausing only to examine the weapons cache that would tell Morrison's team exactly what kind of firepower they were facing. Military-grade rifles, enough ammunition for a sustained campaign, and most disturbing of all, uniforms that would allow the conspirators to impersonate both cavalry soldiers and tribal warriors. The implications were staggering. These men weren't just planning to prevent peace. They intended to commit atrocities while disguised as both sides, ensuring that any hope of reconciliation would be drowned in cycles of revenge that could last for generations. The Blackwood brothers had created a machine for manufacturing profitable hatred. At the camp's edge, where shadows provided concealment from the sentries' lanterns, Mickey began the most dangerous part of his escape. He had to get far enough away to use Iron Horse's signaling mirror without alerting the guards, while moving quickly enough to reach the rendezvous point before his absence was discovered. The signal came at 2:43 a.m., 3 quick flashes followed by 2 long ones, the code for immediate extraction and urgent intelligence. In the rocks above the canyon, Tala saw the reflected moonlight and felt her heart leap with relief that quickly transformed into terror as she realized what the signal meant. "He's alive and he's got information," Morrison whispered, already moving toward the extraction point they'd established. "But something's gone wrong if he's signaling for emergency pickup." The extraction required nerves of steel and timing that allowed no margin for error. Santos and Chun created a diversion on the opposite side of the canyon using techniques learned in countless frontier skirmishes to simulate the sounds of a small raiding party probing the camp's defenses. While the conspirators' attention focused on the false threat, Iron Horse and Morrison descended into the canyon using ropes and climbing skills that would have impressed mountain goats. They reached Mickey's position just as shouts from the camp indicated his absence had been discovered. "The timeline's been moved up," Mickey gasped as strong hands pulled him up the cliff face with mechanical efficiency. "Tomorrow night, not 3 days from now. And there are other teams, other children being used as assassins across the whole territory." The information hit Morrison like a physical blow. If multiple assassination teams were being deployed simultaneously, it meant the conspiracy was larger than any of them had imagined. This wasn't just about preventing one peace summit. It was about ensuring that no peace negotiations could succeed anywhere on the frontier. "How many teams?" he asked as they reached safety among the rocks above the canyon. "How many targets?" "At least 6 that I heard mentioned. Fort Laramie, Fort Robinson, Camp Apache, and 3 locations I didn't recognize. Each team has a child trained to get close to tribal leaders, and each child is supposed to die after completing the assassination." Tala felt sick as the scope of the atrocity became clear. Somewhere across the territory, other children like Mickey were being prepared for missions that would end with their deaths. Their young lives sacrificed to feed a machine that turned human suffering into profit. "We have to warn them," she sighed, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd already lost one child to circumstances beyond her control. "We can't let this happen to other families, other communities." "Agreed," Morrison said grimly. "But warning them means splitting our forces when we're already outnumbered. We'll have to choose between stopping the Fort Bridger assassination and preventing the others." The tactical dilemma was brutal in its simplicity. They had the resources to disrupt one assassination plot, but attempting to stop all 6 would likely result in failing to prevent any of them. It was the kind of choice that defined military leadership, the terrible mathematics of sacrifice that determined who lived and who died. "What if we don't have to choose?" Mickey said quietly, his young mind working through possibilities with the clarity that sometimes came to those who'd been forced to think like adults. "What if there's a way to stop all the assassinations with one action?" Morrison looked at him sharply. "Explain." "Major Blackwood is the source of all their intelligence. If we can expose him publicly, if we can prove he's been feeding information to his brother, then all the assassination teams lose their tactical advantage. They'll be operating blind, and the military commanders will know to watch for exactly the kind of attack being planned." The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, but implementing it would require getting to Fort Bridger ahead of the assassination team while gathering evidence that could convince skeptical military officers that one of their own was a traitor. It would mean everything depending on perfect timing and flawless execution. "It's our best option," Tala agreed, her tactical instincts, inherited from generations of warriors who'd learned to fight against overwhelming odds. "But it means Mickey has to go to Fort Bridger as planned, has to maintain his cover until we can expose Blackwood publicly." "No," Morrison said flatly, "we're not putting that boy back in danger. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Mickey said with quiet determination. "Captain, you know as well as I do that sometimes the mission requires sacrifices. But this time, I'm choosing to make the sacrifice instead of having it forced on me." The words hung in the pre-dawn air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying weight that silenced the adults who'd been trying to protect him. This child had moved beyond needing their protection, had become something more dangerous to his enemies than they could have imagined. Fort Bridger sprawled across a natural plateau like a small city built for war, its wooden walls and stone buildings designed to house the complex negotiations that would determine whether the Arizona Territory moved toward peace or descended into chaos. Smoke from cooking fires and the sounds of preparation filled the air as delegates from 6 tribes and territorial officials converged for talks that everyone knew represented the last hope for avoiding total warfare, Major Harrison Blackwood. stood on the fort's main parade ground, supervising arrangements with the efficiency of an officer who understood that details could determine the success or failure of critically important events. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing suggested complete confidence in his abilities, and nothing in his demeanor hinted at the fact that he was systematically betraying everyone who trusted him. "The tribal delegates will be housed in the Eastern Barracks," he explained to Colonel William Parker, the fort's commanding officer. "Security will be provided by rotating shifts of hand-picked personnel, and all access to the delegates will be strictly controlled." Parker nodded approvingly, unaware that he was receiving advice from the very person who'd been providing his enemies with detailed intelligence about fort operations. "What about the civilian observers?" "We've received requests from several territorial newspapers to cover the negotiations. I've prepared a list of approved journalists and their credential requirements," Blackwood replied smoothly. "We want transparency in the process, but we also need to ensure that sensitive discussions aren't compromised by premature disclosure." It was a masterful performance, the traitor positioning himself as the guardian of security while actually undermining every protective measure being implemented. His access to all communications, all planning sessions, and all security arrangements gave him the ability to anticipate and counter any defensive measures that might interfere with his brother's assassination plot. 20 miles away, Morrison's team prepared for the most complex military operation any of them had ever attempted. They would have to infiltrate a heavily guarded military installation, expose a traitor who held a position of ultimate trust, and prevent multiple assassinations while ensuring that their evidence was compelling enough to convince skeptical authorities. "The key is timing," Morrison explained as his men checked their equipment one final time. "We need to let Mickey get close enough to the delegates to identify the assassination team's plans, but we have to expose Blackwood before those plans can be implemented." Santos had spent the night modifying their communication equipment to work within the fort's stone walls, while Chun prepared disguises that would allow them to move through the installation without being recognized as outsiders. Iron Horse worked on contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine, from successful exposure of the conspiracy to having to fight their way out against overwhelming odds. "Remember," Morrison continued, "our primary objective is preventing the assassinations. Everything else, including our own safety, is secondary to that goal. These peace talks represent the only hope for ending decades of warfare, and we cannot allow them to fail because we prioritized caution over effectiveness." Tala prepared for her own role in the operation, one that would require her to enter the fort openly as a representative of the mixed communities that existed along the frontier. Her presence would provide legitimacy for their warnings while giving her access to tribal leaders who might otherwise be suspicious of military intelligence. "The delegates need to understand that this threat comes from people who profit from warfare," she said, checking the traditional credentials that would mark her as a legitimate spokesperson for her people. "They need to know that someone has been systematically betraying both sides to ensure that peace negotiations always fail." As the sun rose over the territorial landscape, 3 separate groups began converging on Fort Bridger with agendas that would determine the future of thousands of people. The conspirators moved with the confidence of those who believed their plans were undetectable. The defenders operated with the desperation of people who knew they were outgunned and outnumbered. And at the center of it all, a traumatized child, prepared to risk everything to prevent other children from suffering as he had. Mickey's arrival at Fort Bridger was orchestrated with theatrical precision, designed to reinforce his cover story while positioning him for maximum access to the tribal delegates. He was brought in by a cavalry patrol that had supposedly found him wandering the desert, a traumatized survivor of an Indian raid who needed protection during the sensitive negotiations. "Poor kid," Sergeant Murphy said as he helped Mickey down from the supply wagon that had transported him the final miles to the fort. "Been through hell, according to the patrol that found him." Whole family killed, homestead burned, spent days hiding in the wilderness. The performance was flawless, with Mickey displaying exactly the right combination of fear and exhaustion that would be expected from a genuine survivor. But beneath the facade, his mind worked with calculating precision as he observed the fort's layout, identified potential escape routes, and began locating the tribal delegates who would be arriving within hours. Major Blackwood appeared with concerned efficiency, his manner suggesting nothing more than professional interest in the child's welfare. "Sergeant, take the boy to the medical station for examination, then house him in the guest quarters near the officers' mess. We'll want to keep him comfortable while we arrange for his care after the negotiations conclude." The exchange was conducted with perfect normalcy, two military professionals making reasonable arrangements for an unfortunate civilian. Nothing in their interaction suggested that one of them was a traitor and the other was an enemy agent. Nothing hinted at the deadly game being played out beneath the surface of routine military courtesy. In the medical station, Mickey submitted to examination by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a frontier physician whose experience treating trauma victims made her uniquely qualified to assess his condition. But her medical training also made her sensitive to inconsistencies that might reveal the truth about his background. "You've been through something terrible," she said gently, noting the way he flinched from unexpected movements while remaining alert to his surroundings in a manner that suggested training rather than natural wariness. "But some of these injuries look older than the raid you supposedly survived." Mickey's response was carefully crafted to deflect suspicion while providing explanation for any inconsistencies she might have noticed. "I've been on my own for a while," he said quietly. "Even before the raid, things were hard. People don't always treat children kindly when there's no one to protect them." The explanation satisfied her professional curiosity while reinforcing his cover story, and she completed her examination without detecting the carefully concealed weapons and communication equipment that Santos had built into his clothing. Her medical report would show exactly what the conspirators wanted the fort's command to see: a traumatized child in need of protection and care. As evening approached and the tribal delegates began arriving at the fort, Mickey positioned himself where he could observe their movements, while appearing to be nothing more than a frightened boy seeking the comfort of adult presence. The delegates themselves represented 6 different tribes with generations of mutual suspicion and occasional warfare, brought together by the desperate hope that cooperation might offer better survival prospects than continued conflict. Chief Joseph Running Bear of the Apache carried himself with the dignity of a leader who'd seen his people decimated by warfare but refused to surrender their cultural identity to achieve peace. His weathered face showed the weight of decisions that could determine whether his grandchildren grew up free or in reservation captivity. War Chief Michael Two Hawks of the Navajo moved with the controlled grace of a warrior who'd earned his position through combat effectiveness but understood that political skill might prove more valuable than martial prowess in the battles ahead. His eyes missed nothing as he evaluated potential threats and opportunities within the fort's walls. Chief Sarah Crowfeather of the Cheyenne, the only female leader among the delegates, commanded respect through intelligence and diplomatic skill that had kept her people alive through conflicts that had destroyed neighboring tribes. Her presence represented hope that traditional gender roles might evolve to meet the challenges of a changing world. Each delegate brought their own security personnel, warriors whose job was to protect their leaders while remaining alert for treachery from any source. The fort's garrison had been reinforced with additional troops, creating a complex web of armed groups, whose loyalty to the peace process would be tested when the assassination attempt began. As darkness settled over Fort Bridger, Mickey made his final preparations for the night that would determine whether his suffering had meaning or whether it would be multiplied across the territory as other children died in service to the Blackwood brothers' profitable hatred. Through carefully positioned mirrors, he sent his final signal to Morrison's team, positioned outside the fort's walls. The message was simple but carried implications that made his hands shake as he transmitted it. The tribal delegates were in position. The assassination team was in place, and Major Blackwood had made his final preparations for betraying everyone who trusted him. Tomorrow would bring either justice or catastrophe, and a traumatized child would stand at the center of events that could reshape the future of an entire territory. Dawn broke over Fort Bridger with deceptive tranquility, golden light illuminating. The wooden walls and stone buildings that housed what everyone believed would be the most important peace, negotiations in territorial history. In the officers' mess, tribal delegates shared breakfast with military commanders in a display of cooperation that represented decades of progress toward mutual understanding. Major Harrison Blackwood moved through the gathering with practiced diplomatic skill, ensuring that every detail of the day's proceedings served his hidden agenda while appearing to facilitate the very peace process he intended to destroy. His briefing notes contained accurate information about security arrangements, discussion topics, and participant backgrounds, but they also contained subtle modifications that would position the tribal delegates exactly where his brother's assassins needed them to be. "Chief Running Bear," he said with apparent warmth, "I've arranged for your morning session to take place in the East Conference Room, where the natural lighting will be most comfortable for extended discussions. The seating arrangement has been designed to accommodate traditional protocols while encouraging productive dialogue." The Apache leader nodded approvingly, unaware that the East Conference Room's windows provided perfect sightlines for snipers positioned in the surrounding hills, and that the seating arrangement would place him in the exact position where a child with a concealed weapon could strike without being detected until it was too late. Mickey observed these preparations from his position near the kitchen staff, his young presence so unremarkable that adults barely noticed him while he cataloged every detail that might prove crucial in the hours ahead. His modified Derringer remained hidden in his boot, but more importantly, his understanding of the assassination plan gave him the ability to anticipate and disrupt it at the critical moment. Through the fort's stone walls, Morrison's team maintained surveillance while waiting for the signal that would indicate the moment had come to expose Major Blackwood's treachery. Tala positioned herself among the civilian observers who'd been granted access to witness the negotiations, her traditional dress marking her as a representative of the mixed communities whose survival depended on achieving lasting peace. "The delegates seem optimistic," she observed to Colonel Parker, who'd paused to ensure that the civilian observers understood the historical significance of what they were witnessing. "After so many years of conflict, there's finally hope that our children might grow up without the constant threat of warfare." Parker nodded with the weary satisfaction of a career soldier who'd seen too much death and destruction. "Mrs. Nightwind, I've served on this frontier for 15 years, and I've never seen tribal leaders and territorial officials this committed to finding peaceful solutions. If these negotiations succeed, they could serve as a model for ending conflicts across the entire West." The irony was devastating. These good people, working with genuine dedication toward peace and mutual understanding, had no idea that their efforts were being systematically undermined by someone they trusted completely. Major Blackwood's position gave him the ability to sabotage every protective measure while appearing to strengthen them. In the hills surrounding the fort, the colonel's assassination team made final preparations with the confidence of professionals who believed their plan was undetectable. Each sniper had been positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would ensure no tribal delegate could escape the killing zone, while explosive charges had been placed to create chaos that would prevent effective response from the fort's garrison. "Remember," the colonel told his men through hand signals that wouldn't be detected by military observers, "the child initiates the action by striking the primary target. That's your signal to begin the general assault. Make it look like a coordinated Indian attack. Use the captured weapons and uniforms to ensure the blame falls on the tribes themselves." The plan's diabolical brilliance lay in its psychological impact. The assassination of tribal leaders by what appeared to be other tribal warriors would shatter any possibility of trust between the different groups, while the child's involvement would suggest that even the youngest members of native communities had been corrupted by bloodthirsty savagery. But the conspirators had made one critical error in their planning. They'd assumed that Mickey remained the broken, compliant tool they'd created through months of brutal conditioning. They couldn't imagine that a traumatized child might choose courage over survival, that the very weapon they'd forged might be turned against them at the moment of their triumph. The morning session began with ceremonial presentations that honored the traditions of all participating cultures, tribal leaders offering sacred items while territorial officials presented documents that represented their commitment to peaceful coexistence. The symbolism was powerful, suggesting that different peoples could maintain their distinct identities while finding common ground for cooperation. Chief Two Hawks spoke with eloquence about his people's desire to end the cycle of revenge that had consumed too many lives on both sides of the conflict. "We come here not as conquered people seeking mercy, but as equals offering partnership. Our children deserve to inherit a world where strength is measured by the ability to build rather than destroy." War Chief Crow Feather followed with observations about the practical benefits of peace, pointing out that resources currently devoted to warfare could be redirected toward education, medical care, and economic development that would benefit everyone in the territory. Her words carried the authority of someone who'd proven her warrior skills, but chosen to pursue diplomatic solutions. Major Blackwood facilitated these discussions with apparent enthusiasm, while privately noting that the delegates were positioning themselves exactly as his intelligence had predicted. His brother's snipers would have clear shots at all the primary targets, and the child assassin sat close enough to strike without warning when the predetermined signal was given. Mickey felt the weight of the concealed derringer against his ankle as he listened to these leaders speak about hope and cooperation with the passionate conviction of people who'd risked everything to attend these negotiations. The contrast between their noble intentions and the evil plot he was supposed to implement made his chest tight with emotion that had nothing to do with his previous trauma. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Major Blackwood gave the signal that was supposed to initiate the massacre. A casual adjustment of his uniform collar that would be invisible to everyone except the child, who'd been trained to watch for it. The moment when Mickey was supposed to draw his weapon and plunge the territory into irreversible warfare. Instead, Mickey stood and spoke with the clear, carrying voice of someone who'd found the courage to choose truth over survival. "Excuse me, but I need to tell everyone something important. My name is Michael Carson, and the man standing behind Chief Running Bear isn't who you think he is." The words cut through the conference room like gunfire, bringing every conversation to an immediate halt as adults turned to stare at the child, who'd interrupted the most important negotiations in territorial history. Major Blackwood's face went white as he realized that his carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him. "This boy has been traumatized by recent events," Blackwood said quickly, his military training allowing him to maintain composure despite the catastrophe unfolding before him. "He's been through terrible experiences that have affected his ability to distinguish between reality and the nightmares that plague him." But Mickey continued speaking with devastating precision, his young voice carrying details that no traumatized child should know. "Major Blackwood has been sending information to his brother, who's been organizing attacks on families to force them off their land. They plan to kill all of you today and make it look like tribal warfare so the fighting would never stop, Colonel." Parker rose from his seat with the controlled urgency of a commander, recognizing an immediate threat to his installation. "Son, those are extremely serious accusations. Do you have any evidence to support what you're saying?" Mickey reached into his boot and withdrew not the weapon he was supposed to use for assassination, but a packet of documents that Santos had helped him prepare during their preparations. "These are copies of correspondence between Major Blackwood and the people who've been staging fake Indian raids. There are also details about assassination teams being sent to other forts today. The documents hit the conference table like explosive charges, their impact magnified by the shocked silence that followed Mickey's revelations. Chief Running Bear picked up one of the papers with hands that trembled slightly as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. This contains information about my travel plans that was supposed to be confidential, he said slowly. Details about my security arrangements, my personal habits, even my dietary preferences. No one outside the Peace Commission should have had access to this information. War Chief Two Hawks examined another document, his warrior's instincts, recognizing tactical intelligence when he saw it. These are detailed maps showing the best positions for ambush attacks on tribal delegations. Someone has been planning our deaths with military precision. Major Blackwood made his final desperate play, drawing his sidearm with the smooth efficiency of a professional soldier while calculating his chances of fighting his way out of the trap that had closed around him. But his movement triggered responses from multiple directions as tribal warriors, army officers, and one small boy reacted with the reflexes of people who'd learned to expect treachery. "Don't move another inch," Colonel Parker commanded, his own weapon drawn and aimed at his subordinate's chest. "Major, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and violation of your oath as an officer in the United States Army." The exposure of Major Blackwood's treachery triggered a cascade of revelations that unraveled the entire conspiracy with breathtaking speed. Within minutes of his arrest, telegraph messages were racing toward the other forts where assassination attempts had been planned, warning commanders to watch for suspicious activity and protect tribal delegates who might be in immediate danger. Morrison's team emerged from concealment outside the fort's walls. Their mission transformed from infiltration to support as the evidence Mickey had provided gave them the authority to operate openly. Santos and Chun began documenting the sniper positions and explosive charges that had been placed to support the assassination attempt, while Iron Horse coordinated communications with military units across the territory. "We count at least 8 sniper positions in the surrounding hills," Santos reported to Colonel Parker. "Professional work using military-grade equipment that suggests significant financial backing. This wasn't some improvised criminal operation. This was a coordinated military assault disguised as tribal warfare." Tala found herself thrust into the role of interpreter and cultural liaison as tribal leaders struggled to process the revelation that someone they'd trusted had been systematically betraying their peace efforts. Her presence provided a bridge between cultures that might otherwise have retreated into mutual suspicion after such a devastating breach of trust. "The important thing to remember," she told Chief Crowfeather, "is that this conspiracy succeeded only as long as it remained hidden. Now that we know the truth, now that we understand how our enemies have been manipulating us, we can work together to ensure it never happens again." The tribal delegates' response to the crisis demonstrated the wisdom that had brought them to the negotiating table in the first place. Instead of allowing the betrayal to destroy their faith in the peace process, they used it as evidence of why cooperation was more necessary than ever. If their enemies had gone to such lengths to prevent peace, it proved that peace represented a genuine threat to those who profited from warfare. Chief Running Bear spoke for all the delegates when he addressed Colonel Parker directly. "This betrayal doesn't change our commitment to these negotiations. It strengthens it. We've seen what our enemies are willing to do to prevent peace, and that makes peace even more valuable than we realized." As the morning progressed, more evidence of the conspiracy's scope continued to surface. Telegraph responses from other forts revealed that similar plots had been disrupted at Fort Laramie and Camp Apache, while ongoing investigations were uncovering financial connections between the Blackwood brothers and Eastern business interests that had profited from decades of frontier warfare. The colonel himself was captured while attempting to escape with the remnants of his assassination team, his arrest providing the final piece of evidence needed to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. Under interrogation, he revealed details about funding sources, recruitment methods, and training facilities that painted a picture of systematic evil disguised as legitimate business. We estimate they've been responsible for at least 40 incidents over the past 3 years, Morrison reported to the assembled delegates and military officers. Attacks blamed on tribal raiders, settler violence, military overreach, all of it orchestrated to prevent exactly the kind of cooperation we're seeing here today. But the most important revelation came from Mickey himself, as he began to share details about other children who'd been taken and trained for similar missions. His information led to rescue operations across the territory, bringing children home to families who'd given them up for dead while preventing future assassinations that could have destabilized the entire region. There are others, he told the adults who'd gathered to hear his testimony. Kids like me who were taken from their families and turned into weapons. They're out there somewhere, probably scared and thinking they have no choice but to do what they're told. But they do have choices just like I did. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Fort Bridger, the peace negotiations resumed with a new sense of urgency and purpose. The delegates now understood that their success would deal a devastating blow to forces that had worked for years to keep the territory locked in profitable violence. The conspiracy had been designed to exploit cultural differences and historical grievances, but its exposure had actually brought the different communities closer together. Tribal leaders, military officers, territorial officials, and civilian observers now shared a common enemy and a common cause that transcended the boundaries that had previously divided them. Mickey sat in the conference room where he'd been supposed to commit murder, watching adults work together to build the kind of world he'd never dared to imagine. The weapon concealed in his boot remained unused, except as evidence of the evil he'd chosen to reject, while the courage he'd found within himself had become a tool for creation rather than destruction. The peace summit that was supposed to end in massacre had become something greater than anyone had envisioned. A moment when people of different cultures discovered that their shared humanity was stronger than the hatred others had tried to cultivate. Between them, in the fort's makeshift detention facility, Major Harrison Blackwood sat shackled to a wooden chair while Colonel Parker conducted the most important interrogation of his military career. The evidence against the traitorous officer was overwhelming, but Parker needed details about the conspiracy's full scope to ensure that no other plots remained active. "How long have you been feeding intelligence to your brother's operation?" Parker demanded, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a commander who discovered betrayal within his own ranks. "How many good soldiers died because you gave their enemies advance warning of patrol routes and supply schedules?" Blackwood maintained the arrogant composure of someone who believed his connections would ultimately protect him from consequences. "Colonel, you're making a serious mistake. My brother's business interests have powerful supporters in Washington, men who understand that profitable stability requires occasional managed instability. When they learn of my arrest, your powerful friends can't help you now," Parker interrupted, spreading photographs across the table that showed the evidence Morrison's team had gathered from the sniper positions. "We have documentation of your correspondence, testimony from multiple witnesses, and physical evidence that places you at the center of a conspiracy to commit mass murder." The photographs were devastating in their clarity, showing not just the planned assassination positions, but also the uniforms and weapons that would have been used to disguise the attack as tribal warfare. Each image represented another nail in the coffin of Blackwood's defense, another piece of proof that his crimes extended far beyond simple treason. "The boy's testimony alone is enough to hang you," Parker continued, his voice growing colder with each revelation. "But we also have the financial records your brother was careless enough to maintain, showing payments for weapons, equipment, and personnel that could only have been coordinated with inside military intelligence." Santos entered the detention area carrying a wooden crate filled with additional evidence that had been recovered from the abandoned sniper positions. "Colonel, you need to see this." We found detailed maps of reservation boundaries, mining surveys, and railroad development plans that explain the real motive behind the assassination plot. The contents of the crate painted a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy's true scope. This wasn't just about preventing peace negotiations. It was about clearing tribal populations from specific territories that had been identified as valuable for mining and railroad development. The Blackwood brothers had been systematically eliminating obstacles to Eastern investment schemes. Estimated value of the land in question is over $50 million. Santos reported, examining documents that showed the breathtaking scale of the financial interests involved. Enough money to fund private armies, buy political influence, and orchestrate years of carefully planned violence designed to drive native populations off valuable territory. Parker felt sick as he absorbed the implications of what they'd uncovered. The suffering of thousands of families, the deaths of soldiers and civilians on both sides of the conflict, the destruction of communities that had taken generations to build. All of it had been orchestrated to serve the profit margins of Eastern businessmen who'd never set foot on the frontier. Major Blackwood, he said with deadly quiet, you're going to tell me the names of every person involved in this conspiracy, every politician who's been bought, every military officer who's been compromised. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you face the full consequences of military justice for treason during wartime. While Blackwood's interrogation continued, telegraph messages poured into Fort Bridger from across the territory as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Military commanders who'd been operating with incomplete information suddenly understood why their efforts to maintain peace had been systematically undermined. Fort Laramie reports they've arrested 3 men disguised as tribal warriors who were positioned to attack the peace delegation there, Iron Horse announced, reading the latest dispatch. Camp Apache interdicted a wagon load of weapons that were being transported to simulate an Indian raid on the negotiations. Each report confirmed what Mickey's courage had revealed, that the assassination plot at Fort Bridger was just one component of a coordinated campaign designed to prevent peace negotiations across the entire frontier. The conspiracy's architects had planned to blame every attack on tribal extremists, ensuring that any possibility of reconciliation would be destroyed by cycles of revenge. Tala found herself serving as an unofficial coordinator between the military response and the tribal delegates, her unique position allowing her to bridge cultural gaps that might otherwise have complicated the investigation. Her own experiences with the mixed community around the neutral gave her credibility with leaders who might have been suspicious of purely military authority. The delegates want to know how we can be certain there aren't other traitors in positions of trust, she reported to Colonel Parker. Chief Two Hawks specifically asked about the possibility that this conspiracy extends into the territorial government itself. The question struck at the heart of the delegates' deepest fears. If military officers could be corrupted by Eastern business interests, how could they trust civilian officials who might have even stronger financial incentives to maintain profitable warfare? The peace process required trust that had been systematically undermined by years of carefully orchestrated betrayal. Morrison entered the command center with additional intelligence that painted an even grimmer picture of the conspiracy's reach. We've identified at least 12 territorial officials who've received payments from companies controlled by the Blackwood brothers. Judges, land commissioners, territorial legislators, even the governor's chief of staff. The corruption was more extensive than anyone had imagined, reaching into every level of government that controlled land use, mining rights, and railroad development. The peace negotiations hadn't just threatened one family's criminal enterprise. They'd threatened an entire network of politicians and businessmen who'd been profiting from territorial instability. How do we proceed with negotiations when we can't trust our own government? Chief Running Bear asked, his weathered face showing the strain of discovering that their enemies had been operating from within the very institutions that were supposed to protect both settlers and tribal communities. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Mitchell, who'd been treating Mickey for his injuries, had been quietly documenting evidence of the conspiracy's impact on civilian populations. Her medical records showed patterns of trauma and displacement that correlated directly with land acquisition schemes. "We proceed by trusting each other instead of trusting institutions," she said simply. "The peace process doesn't have to depend on territorial government approval. Treaties can be negotiated directly between tribal leaders and military commanders who've proven their integrity through actions rather than words." As evening approached, Mickey was joined by 3 other children who'd been rescued from assassination training camps across the territory. Their combined testimony provided a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy's methods while offering hope that other young victims might still be recovered. Sarah Littlefoot, a 9-year-old Cheyenne girl who'd been taken during a fake raid on her village, spoke with the halting voice of someone still processing traumatic memories. "They said they were teaching us to survive, but really they were teaching us to kill people who looked like our families. They wanted us to hate our own people." Marcus Wilhelm, a 10-year-old son of German immigrants whose parents had been murdered to clear their homestead for railroad development, described training methods that were designed to break children's natural empathy and replace it with mechanical obedience. "They made us practice on animals first, then on prisoners they said were enemies. They told us it was war, and war didn't have rules." Rosa Martinez, an 8-year-old whose Mexican-American family had been targeted for their strategic ranch location, revealed details about the conspiracy's recruitment methods that explained how they'd been able to operate for years without detection. They looked for kids who had nobody left to look for them, kids whose families had been killed in raids they probably arranged themselves. The children's testimony was devastating in its clarity, providing evidence that the conspiracy had been systematically destroying families specifically to acquire children who could be trained as weapons. The scope of the evil was almost incomprehensible, representing a level of calculated cruelty that challenged everyone's understanding of human nature. "We estimate they've taken over 30 children during the past 3 years, Morrison reported grimly. "Some have been recovered, some were killed when they refused to cooperate, and others are still missing. This rescue operation is going to continue for months as we track down every camp and safe house they've established." But the children also provided hope. Their courage in speaking truth about their experiences, their refusal to be defined by what had been done to them, demonstrated a resilience that offered promise for healing and recovery. If they could overcome such systematic abuse, perhaps the territory itself could overcome the damage that had been inflicted by years of orchestrated violence. "The important thing," Mickey told the adults who'd gathered to hear their testimony, "is that we're not broken. They tried to break us, but we're still here, and we're still choosing to do the right thing. That means other kids can make the same choice if someone gives them the chance." As night fell over Fort Bridger, the peace negotiations resumed with a new understanding of what they were fighting against and what they were fighting for. The conspiracy had been exposed, its leaders arrested, and its immediate threat neutralized. But the real work of building lasting peace was just beginning. The children who'd been turned into weapons had become symbols of hope, proof that even the most systematic evil could be overcome by individuals who chose courage over compliance, truth over survival, and love over hate. The sound of children's laughter echoing across the valley where Tala's cabin stood had become so common that she sometimes forgot how rare such sounds had been during the years of constant warfare. The neutral well that had once marked a fragile boundary between hostile communities now served as the center of a thriving settlement where families from different cultures worked together to build something unprecedented in territorial history. Mickey, now 9 years old and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced the worst of human nature and chosen to believe in its capacity for good, supervised a group of younger children as they tended the community garden that fed both settler and native families. His experiences had left scars that would never fully heal, but they'd also given him wisdom that made him a natural leader among his peers. "Remember what we learned about the corn," he told 6-year-old Anna Peterson, who's Swedish immigrant. Parents had been among the first to join the mixed community. The Apache way of planting in circles helps the plants support each other when the wind gets strong. That's why we do things differently here than in the old country. The integration of agricultural techniques from different cultures had become a symbol of the broader cooperation that was transforming the territory. Native knowledge of drought-resistant crops combined with European farming innovations to produce yields that exceeded what any single community could have achieved alone. Tala watched these interactions from the porch of the cabin that had been expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to see how former enemies had learned to prosper together. Her role had evolved from frontier widow to unofficial ambassador for a movement that was spreading across the territory faster than anyone had anticipated. Mrs. Night Wind called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd left her position at Fort Bridger, to establish the territory's first integrated medical practice. The delegation from the Territorial Council is here for their quarterly inspection. They seem particularly interested in our educational programs. The educational programs had become the community's most remarkable achievement, with children from different cultural backgrounds learning together in ways that would have been unimaginable during the years of systematic conflict. Native languages were taught alongside English and Spanish, while traditional skills from all cultures were preserved and passed on to the next generation. In the territorial capital, the trials of the Blackwood conspiracy members had concluded, with sentences that reflected the scope of their crimes against both military honor and human decency. Major Harrison Blackwood himself had been executed by military tribunal, while his brother faced life imprisonment for crimes that had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Captain Morrison, now promoted to major for his role in exposing the conspiracy, served as the military's chief liaison to the new peace commission that oversaw territorial affairs. His experience with the investigation had convinced him that lasting stability required more than military victory. It required institutions that could bridge cultural divides and prevent future exploitation. The final count of recovered children stands at 47. He reported to the monthly meeting of community leaders that had replaced the old system of separate tribal councils and territorial administration. Each one represents a family that was destroyed by the conspiracy's operations, but also a future that can be rebuilt through community support. Santos and Iron Horse had established a specialized unit within the Territorial Marshal Service that focused on preventing the kind of systematic exploitation that had made the conspiracy possible. Their investigation methods, combining military intelligence techniques with traditional native tracking skills, had become a model for law enforcement across the frontier. We've identified and shut down 6 more land speculation schemes that were using violence to drive families off valuable property, Santos reported. The legal framework established after the trials gives us the authority to investigate any suspicious pattern of attacks or displacement. Chun had founded a school for children who'd been traumatized by the conspiracy's operations using techniques that honored different cultural approaches to healing, while providing the practical skills needed for success in the changing territory. His work had attracted attention from educators across the country, who were seeking alternatives to the harsh assimilation methods that had characterized previous government policies. "The children are teaching us as much as we're teaching them," he observed during his monthly progress report. Their resilience and their ability to form bonds across cultural lines demonstrates possibilities that most adults wouldn't have imagined. The peace that had been preserved through Mickey's courage and the community's cooperation had unleashed economic development that transformed the territory's prospects in ways that the war profiteers had never anticipated. Without the constant threat of violence, families could invest in long-term improvements rather than simply trying to survive. From season to season, the railroad lines that the Blackwood brothers had planned to build through territories cleared by violence were being constructed through negotiated agreements that provided compensation to displaced communities while ensuring that development benefited everyone rather than just Eastern investors. Native tribes retained ownership of mineral rights while receiving employment opportunities that didn't require abandoning their cultural identities. Production figures for the past quarter exceed all projections, reported James Standing. Wolf, the Navajo economist who'd become the territory's first Native member of the Development Commission. When people aren't afraid of being murdered for their land, they're remarkably productive. The mixed communities that had emerged around places like Tala's Well were becoming economic powerhouses that combined the agricultural knowledge of Native peoples with the industrial techniques brought by immigrant settlers. Their success attracted families from across the country who were seeking alternatives to the urban poverty and industrial exploitation that characterized much of American development. We're receiving applications from families in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston who want to join our communities, Tala reported to the quarterly Territorial Assembly. People are learning that cooperation produces better results than competition, and they want to be part of something that offers hope rather than just survival. As the anniversary of the failed assassination plot approached, Mickey found himself reflecting on the journey that had transformed him from a traumatized victim into a symbol of hope for the entire territory. The nightmares that had once plagued his sleep had gradually been replaced by dreams of the future he was helping to build. His relationship with Tala had evolved beyond the initial rescue into something that resembled the bond between a traditional grandmother and grandson, with her providing cultural wisdom while he contributed the perspective of someone who'd seen both the worst and best of human nature. Their conversations often served as informal counseling sessions for other children who were struggling to process their own traumatic experiences. "Do you ever regret not running away that morning at the well?" Tala asked as they worked together to prepare for the anniversary celebration that would bring together representatives from communities across the territory. "You could have chosen safety instead of responsibility." Mickey paused in his work, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that had become his trademark. "I think about Mrs. Henderson a lot," he said finally. "About how she smiled at me even when she was dying, how she trusted me to do the right thing. If I'd run away, if I'd let them use other kids the way they used me, then her death really would have meant nothing." His role in the community had become that of a bridge between the adult world of politics and planning and the children's world of possibility and hope. Other young people sought his advice when they struggled with their own traumatic histories, while adults valued his insights into the long-term consequences of policy decisions. "The thing I learned," he told a group of children who'd gathered to hear his story, "is that being afraid doesn't make you weak, and being hurt doesn't make you broken. What matters is what you choose to do with the fear and the hurt. You can let them control you, or you can use them to understand why it's important to protect other people." The ceremony marking the first anniversary of the Fort Bridger incident brought together over 3,000 people from across the territory, representing every culture and community that had been affected by the conspiracy's operations. The gathering itself demonstrated the transformation that had occurred, with former enemies now sharing food, music, and stories in a celebration of their common humanity. Chief Running Bear, now serving as the elected chairman of the Intertribal Council, spoke about the lessons learned from nearly losing everything to the greed and hatred of others. "We came so close to destroying ourselves through suspicion and revenge that we almost didn't recognize the real enemy until it was too late. Now we know that our strength comes from our unity, not from our ability to fight each other." Colonel Parker, who'd been promoted to territorial administrator for his role in exposing the conspiracy, reflected on the changes that had occurred within military culture as a result of the investigation. "We learned that true security comes from earning the trust of the people we're supposed to protect, not from maintaining superiority over them. Partnership produces better results than domination." The children who'd been rescued from the assassination training camps performed a song they'd written about finding hope in darkness. their voices blending traditional melodies from different cultures into something entirely new. Their performance moved many adults to tears as they realized how close they'd come to losing these young lives to manufactured hatred. "We are the children who were supposed to die for other people's profits," sang Sarah Littlefoot, her voice carrying across the gathering with surprising strength. "But we chose to live for our own dreams instead." As the celebration continued into the evening, Mickey found himself standing beside the monument that had been erected at the site of the original neutral well. The stone marker bore the names of all those who died as a result of the conspiracy's operations, along with an inscription that captured the community's commitment to ensuring such tragedy never occurred again. "In memory of those who died, for others' greed, and in honor of those who chose love over hate, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair. May their sacrifice inspire us to build a world worthy of our children's dreams." Dr. Mitchell joined him at the monument, her presence reminding him of the medical care that had helped heal not just his physical wounds, but the emotional trauma that had nearly destroyed his capacity for trust. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first examined you at the fort, I thought I was looking at a child who'd been broken beyond repair. I never imagined you'd become someone who helps other people heal." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger carrying news that would shape the territory's future in ways none of them could have anticipated. The success of their cooperative communities had attracted the attention of the federal government, which was considering their model as a potential solution to conflicts in other regions. "They want to send observers to study our methods," the messenger reported. "There's talk of adapting our approach to situations in other territories where violence has prevented development. You might be asked to travel to Washington to testify before congressional committees, the possibility of spreading their model." Beyond the Arizona territory filled Mickey with excitement that was tempered by awareness of the challenges they'd face. Not everyone would welcome the idea that cooperation could produce better results than domination, and there would certainly be resistance from those who profited from conflict and division. "If they ask me to testify," he told Tala as they walked back toward the cabin that had become the symbolic heart of the mixed community, "I'll tell them the truth about what happens when people choose fear over trust. But I'll also tell them about what becomes possible when they make different choices." As stars appeared in the desert sky above the valley that had been transformed from a battleground into a symbol of hope, Mickey reflected on the journey that had brought him from the brink of destruction to a position where his voice could influence the future of an entire nation. The traumatized child who'd been found shaking by a well had become a young man whose courage and wisdom offered inspiration to anyone who believed in the possibility of positive change. The neutral well still provided water for all who needed it, but it now served a community that had learned to see differences as sources of strength rather than reasons for conflict. Children played games that incorporated traditions from multiple cultures, while adults worked together on projects that would benefit generations yet to come. Tala watched Mickey as he absorbed the significance of the moment, seeing in his face the reflection of possibilities that extended far beyond their small corner of the frontier. The boy she'd found broken and bleeding had grown into someone who understood that healing could become a force more powerful than the violence that had created the wounds. "Come here, child," she said softly, using the same words that had marked the beginning of their journey together. But now the phrase carried different meaning, spoken not to comfort a victim, but to acknowledge a leader who'd earned his authority through suffering transformed into wisdom. The territory that had nearly been destroyed by manufactured hatred had become a model for what America could become when its people chose cooperation over competition, understanding over ignorance, and love over fear. And at the center of that transformation stood a young man who'd learned that sometimes the most important choice anyone can make is to refuse to let evil define the limits of what's possible. The new dawn that had begun with a traumatized child's courage to speak truth to power had become a sunrise that promised to illuminate possibilities that extended far beyond any single community. territory, or generation.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.